The truth about how the 12 apostles died will shock you. While churches romanticize their stories, the reality is brutal and revealing. Peter crucified upside down, Bartholomew skinned alive, Judas with his body exploding after hanging himself. These deaths weren't random. They were the result of a coordinated system for tracking and eliminating carriers of Christic frequency. If you're looking for truths that few people know about how souls on mission are systematically persecuted, get ready to discover patterns that repeat throughout history. Historical records show that Peter quickly transformed from a simple fisherman into the leader of a movement that threatened established power structures. According to writings by Origen and early church traditions, his influence grew exponentially after Jesus' crucifixion. What many don't realize is how this radical transformation emitted a specific energetic frequency that was detected by Roman authorities. Peter was no longer an ordinary follower. He had become an active carrier of Christic frequency that challenged the entire Roman imperial system. Jesus' prophecy in John 21:18-19 about how Peter would die reveals advanced knowledge about how the system would operate against him. When Jesus said Peter would stretch out his hands and another would dress him, he was describing precisely the capture process awaiting anyone who dared to carry this frequency. Historical records confirm that Peter was arrested and executed in Rome during Nero's reign, a period of intense systematic persecution of early Christians. This wasn't random persecution. It was targeted tracking of souls on mission who represented a real threat to the status quo. The tradition of Peter's inverted crucifixion, documented by writers like Origen, reveals the psychological sophistication of elimination methods used against carriers of Christic frequency. Crucifying upside down wasn't just execution, it was a public humiliation ritual designed to symbolically break the spiritual influence Peter had over the masses. Historical documents show that Roman authorities perfectly understood the power of symbols and used specific methods to neutralize not just the individual, but also their ability to inspire others through their example. The fact that Peter requested to be crucified differently from Jesus shows he had completely understood his mission and the price he would pay for it. Records by Eusebius of Caesarea indicate that Peter faced his execution with total serenity, knowing his death would serve to strengthen the movement instead of weakening it. This attitude reveals a common characteristic among souls on mission. They intuitively understand that their physical elimination can, paradoxically, amplify their spiritual impact. The speed with which Peter was located and executed in Rome demonstrates the efficiency of the tracking system used against missionaries. According to historical records, he had arrived in the empire's capital shortly before his capture. This suggests there were networks of informants specifically trained to identify individuals carrying this particular transformative frequency. Peter had become a priority target, not just for his teachings, but for the particular energy he radiated that could awaken dormant capacities in other people. But Peter wouldn't be the only carrier of Christic frequency to be tracked with such precision. The story of brothers James and John reveals how the tracking system operates with strategic sophistication, selectively eliminating carriers of Christic frequency based on their specific threat profiles. Acts 12:1-2 records that King Herod executed James by the sword, making him the first martyr among the 12. This quick execution wasn't impulsive. It was the result of precise analysis about which of the brothers represented immediate danger to established control. Historical documents indicate that James had developed a more direct and confrontational propagation method, while John operated through more subtle and contemplative influence. Records by Flavius Josephus and other historical sources show that Herod Agrippa I was particularly skilled at identifying emerging leaders who could threaten his authority. James's execution occurred during Passover, a time of high pilgrim concentration in Jerusalem, a calculated public demonstration to intimidate other missionaries. The system had detected that James carried a more explosive Christic frequency, capable of mobilizing crowds quickly. His priority elimination followed the logic of neutralizing first those with the greatest potential to cause immediate popular uprisings. John, on the other hand, was spared not out of mercy, but because the system identified that his profile represented a long-term threat that could be controlled through other strategies. Writings by Tertullian and other patristic sources indicate that John was subjected to execution attempts that mysteriously failed, including the famous attempt to boil him in oil. This suggests there were specific orders to eliminate John only if conventional methods worked. Otherwise, he would be neutralized through exile and isolation. John's exile in Patmos, documented in Revelation 1:9, represents an alternative neutralization strategy used against souls on mission whose profile didn't fit direct elimination. Historical records show that Patmos was used specifically to isolate political and religious prisoners considered too dangerous for summary execution, but controllable through isolation. The system had calculated that John, isolated on a remote island, would be neutralized without creating the martyrdom that could inspire other carriers of Christic frequency. The fundamental difference between the brothers' destinies reveals how the system operates. James was eliminated because his Christic frequency manifested through direct action and immediate popular mobilization. John was isolated because his frequency operated through mystical visions and teachings that, while profound, didn't represent immediate insurrectional threat. Historical documents confirm that John lived to old age in Ephesus after returning from exile, always under discreet surveillance. This dual strategy, elimination versus neutralization, would be systematically applied against other missionaries, always based on specific analysis of the type of Christic frequency each one carried. But soon the system would discover that some carriers were resistant to both strategies. Historical records by Eusebius of Caesarea and other early church chroniclers reveal a coordinated elimination pattern that transcended geographical boundaries and political jurisdictions. Andrew was crucified in Patras, Greece. Bartholomew was martyred in Armenia. Thomas was executed in India. And other missionaries met violent destinies in regions distant from the Roman Empire. This geographical dispersion of executions wasn't coincidence. It demonstrates the existence of a sophisticated communication network that tracked carriers of Christic frequency regardless of where they established themselves. The system had understood that these missionaries weren't just local preachers, but carriers of a specific frequency that needed to be neutralized globally. Historical documentation shows that each execution followed specific methods that seemed calibrated for the particular type of influence each soul on mission exercised. Andrew, known for his ability to make connections and bring people to the movement, was crucified on an X-shaped cross, symbolism that authorities used to represent the cancellation of his multiplication capacity. Records from the Acts of Andrew indicate he remained preaching for 3 days while crucified, demonstrating how carriers of Christic frequency maintain their transmission capacity even under extreme physical torture conditions. Bartholomew, according to records by Abdias and other historical sources, was subjected to the most brutal method recorded among the 12. He was skinned alive before decapitation. This specific type of torture wasn't used randomly, but reserved for individuals, considered extremely dangerous to the established system. Historical documents indicate that Bartholomew had developed Christic frequency transmission methods that could penetrate cultural and religious barriers with particular effectiveness, converting entire populations in regions considered safe by the system. His elimination through skinning represented an attempt to symbolically break his capacity for spiritual penetration. The temporal coordination of these eliminations also reveals impressive operational sophistication. Historical records show that most martyrdoms occurred within a relatively narrow time window, between 60–70 AD, a period coinciding with the intensification of Jewish revolts and exponential growth of the Christian movement. This suggests there was a coordinated plan to simultaneously eliminate the first generation of Christic frequency carriers before they could establish self-sustaining transmission structures. The system had calculated that neutralizing this specific generation could definitively interrupt the propagation of this particular frequency. Thomas, executed in India according to records from Acts of Thomas and other historical sources, represents perhaps the most revealing case about the global extent of tracking. Historical documents indicate he had traveled to regions completely outside direct Roman influence, establishing Christian communities in territories that theoretically would be safe from the persecution system. His location and elimination in Indian territory demonstrates that the tracking network operated through alliances with local authorities and commercial systems that transcended formal political boundaries. The Christic frequency these missionaries carried was detectable by trained observers, regardless of the cultural context where it manifested. But not all records of this coordinated persecution survived intact. The absence of detailed biblical documentation about most apostles' deaths doesn't represent failure in historical preservation, but evidence of a coordinated campaign to erase records. Only James' death was preserved in official canonical texts, while information about other missionaries survived fragmentarily through dispersed sources like apocryphal writings, church fathers' letters, and travelers' accounts. This discrepancy isn't accidental. Historical documents show that Roman authorities developed specific protocols to locate and destroy records related to carriers of Christic frequency. Understanding that documentation of their martyrdoms could inspire future generations of souls on mission. Writings by Pliny the Younger to Emperor Trajan reveal the sophistication of counterintelligence operations developed specifically against early Christians. His letters describe detailed interrogations designed not just to identify individual Christians, but to map complete networks of communication and information preservation. The system had understood that eliminating only leaders was insufficient. It was necessary to also destroy records of their activities and teachings to prevent future missionaries from using this information as operational manuals. This strategy explains why precise details about the deaths of Philip, Matthew, Bartholomew, and others survived only in contradictory fragments. The multiplicity of conflicting versions about how each apostle died reflects not historical confusion, but the result of an information war fought between the persecution system and Christian preservation networks. Records by Eusebius of Caesarea show how different communities developed slightly altered versions of the same stories as a protection strategy. If one version was discovered and destroyed, other versions would preserve essential elements of the original information. This technique of intentional fragmentation allowed knowledge about carriers of Christic frequency to survive through centuries of systematic persecution. Historical documents indicate that entire libraries were burned specifically to eliminate records related to early missionaries. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria and other knowledge centers wasn't just cultural vandalism, but strategic operation to erase evidence about the effectiveness of methods used by carriers of Christic frequency. Records by Jerome and other scholars of the time show how texts about the apostles were systematically removed from official collections, preserved only in secret copies maintained by clandestine networks of Christian scribes. The fragmentary survival of this information through oral traditions and apocryphal texts demonstrates the resilience of preservation strategies developed by souls on mission. Records like the Acts of Andrew, Acts of Thomas, and other non-canonical documents represent courageous attempts to preserve knowledge that the official system tried to completely erase. These sources, though considered unreliable by traditional historiography, often contain specific operational details about how carriers of Christic frequency were identified, tracked, and eliminated. The apparent inconsistency between different versions, when carefully analyzed, reveals patterns that confirm the existence of coordinated persecution operations that transcended local jurisdictions. But among all documented cases, there's one that reveals particularly disturbing aspects about how the system operates. The discovery of the Gospel of Judas in 2006 completely revolutionized our understanding of Judas Iscariot's role, revealing a reality that the system suppressed for centuries. This Gnostic text from the 2nd-3rd century, translated by the National Geographic Society, presents Judas not as a traitor, but as the most spiritually advanced disciple, the one Jesus chose to execute the most crucial and misunderstood part of his mission. According to the document, Jesus said directly to Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This reveals that Judas was actually the highest carrier of Christic frequency among the 12, capable of bearing the spiritual weight of being eternally misunderstood. The Gospel of Judas documents private conversations where Jesus reveals gnostic knowledge exclusively to Judas, teachings that the other disciples weren't prepared to receive. The text records Jesus saying, "Step away from the others and I will tell you the mysteries of the kingdom." This differentiation wasn't favoritism, it was recognition that certain souls on mission possess specific capacities to withstand knowledge that would mentally destroy other individuals. Judas understood realities about the illusory nature of the material world and about the real purpose of crucifixion that completely transcended the other apostles' comprehension. The systematic suppression of this gospel during early Christianity's first centuries reveals deliberate strategy to maintain the official betrayal narrative. Historical documents show that early church leaders, like Irenaeus of Lyon, specifically condemned Gnostic texts that presented alternative versions of Judas's story. This suppression campaign aimed not just to preserve doctrinal orthodoxy, but to prevent future generations from understanding the true operational methods used by carriers of Christic frequency in high-complexity missions. The system had calculated that keeping Judas as a symbol of betrayal would serve as permanent warning against collaboration with authorities. However, deeper analysis reveals that both perspectives, system infiltrator and conscious collaborator, can be simultaneously true, revealing even more complex operational layers. It's possible that Judas was initially recruited as an infiltrator by authorities due to his particular psychological characteristics, but that Jesus, perceiving this, converted the situation into an opportunity to execute an even more sophisticated plan. Gnostic records suggest that Jesus possessed the ability to read people's true intentions and backgrounds around him, using even enemy agents as involuntary instruments of higher purposes. The deepest aspect of this operation is how it demonstrates that truly advanced carriers of Christic frequency can operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously, using even enemy infiltration as a component of strategies that transcend linear understanding. Judas may have simultaneously accepted two contradictory missions, one from authorities to deliver Jesus, another from Jesus to enable crucifixion, without either party completely understanding what was happening. This ability to operate through apparent paradoxes represents a level of spiritual mastery that only extremely advanced souls on mission can achieve. The Gospel of Judas preserves evidence that there are aspects of Christic frequency that transcend simple categories of good and evil, operating through complexities that the conventional system could never fully understand or control. Now you know the truth that's been hidden for centuries. The apostles didn't die by chance, but were systematically tracked and eliminated for carrying Christic frequency. This same pattern repeats today. How many souls on mission around you are being subtly sabotaged? Watch for the signs: coordinated persecution, erasure of records, internal infiltration. The question is, will you keep sleeping, or will you wake up to this reality? If you're a carrier of Christic frequency, you already know your mission comes with risks. The difference is being aware of it. What choice will you make today that your spiritual ancestors made 2,000 years ago? Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to keep discovering truths the system doesn't want you to know. Your awakening journey is just beginning.